Hello, my dear friends. You think living in the Middle Ages was all about riding horses and eating meat by the fire? No, it was a place where a cough could kill you and a loaf of bread could mean death. There was no clean water, no medicine, no name, and no one to remember you when you died. That world had no room for weakness, and death was always just around the corner, waiting. Tonight, let's step into a time where survival was a feat, and the question is, can you survive? So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and how long you have been there. It is always fun to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let us embark on this journey together tonight. If you were to wake in the chill of an English dawn during the Dark Ages, you would find yourself not in a bed, but upon a heap of straw that smells of damp and mildew. The hut around you is silent, except for the faint rustle of small creatures moving in the shadows. There is no floor, only packed earth that drinks in the cold, and no window, only a gap where the wind creeps through. The air is heavy, stale, and filled with the scent of smoke, animal waste, and human breath. Everything feels wet, as if the night never truly ended, and your body aches from lying too long on the uneven ground. It is both absurd and pitiful that this place is called a home when it offers neither rest nor comfort. Your companions in this space are not family, but the life that thrives in filth. Fleas and lice crawl freely through the straw and along your clothes, drawn by the warmth of your skin. Rats scurry close, their tiny claws scratching at scraps of grain. To move too quickly is to stir up more insects. To stay still is to feel them crawl. There is no escape from the constant itch. No moment of stillness without discomfort. The skin becomes a battlefield of bites and scabs. Yet people learn to ignore it because there is nothing else to do. The idea of washing is a luxury. Water is scarce and often filthy, so the body simply adapts to being dirty. When morning arrives, it is not marked by sunlight, but by the faintest gray through cracks in the wall. The smoke from last night's fire still lingers, burning the throat and eyes. You can taste ash in the air, bitter and dry. Every breath reminds you of how small the space is, how little separates you from the animals that live beside you. In many huts, a goat or pig shares the floor, their warmth more useful than any blanket. The sound of snorting, scratching, and chewing is part of waking life. The walls themselves are thin, made from wattle and mud, barely strong enough to keep out rain. In storms, water seeps through, turning the straw beneath you into a cold sponge. Stepping outside does not bring relief. The ground is soaked, slippery with mud and waste. The path between huts is narrow, littered with dung and ash. Smoke from a dozen fires hangs low, mixing with the smell of rotting food. There is no silence, only coughing, the clatter of tools, and the bleating of animals tied too close to homes. If one compares this to a modern morning, it would be like waking up inside a compost heap and calling it normal life. Yet for most people of the Dark Ages, it was all they knew. Warmth was borrowed from beasts. Light was a rare visitor, and comfort was not expected. The body adjusts to misery faster than the mind. After a while, you no longer notice the fleas, the cold, or the damp that clings to every surface. What you feel instead is hunger. The day begins with work, not rest. There is wood to gather, fires to rebuild, and fields to reach before the weak light fades again. Your clothes, still wet from yesterday's rain, are pulled over your shoulders with no hope of drying. Shoes are a rarity, so feet sink directly into the mud. Cuts and sores open and never fully heal. Infection is so common that people stop naming it. Inside the hut, smoke stains the ceiling black. The air tastes of soot and sweat. Pots sit near the fire, coated in old grease. Everything smells of smoke, earth, and animals. The senses dull, and the line between filth and life disappears. There is no privacy, no quiet moment, only the closeness of survival. For families, the hut must hold everyone, parents, children, and animals, all pressed together through the long winter nights. Laughter still exists, but it is faint, often coming from the absurdity of endurance itself. I think about how strange it is that humanity can adapt to such squalor and still call it ordinary. This kind of life wears the body down quickly. Skin grows rough and gray, teeth rot, and joints ache before middle age. The hut traps not only air, but years of smoke, making lungs heavy. To step outside is to face the same cold that seeps through every wall. Yet people endure because there is nothing beyond endurance. Hope is not an emotion here. It is a habit practiced quietly like breathing. At night, when the fire fades and the last glow turns to smoke, the darkness feels alive. The same rats that hid during the day return to the corners. Children sleep in the straw beside their parents, their small bodies curled tight to keep warm. The sound of coughing, scratching, and breathing fills the hut until dawn comes again, bringing only the faint illusion of change. The straw hut was not a refuge, but a reminder of how fragile life could be. It held families together in filth and cold because there was nowhere else to go. From this fragile shelter, every day began with struggle and ended in exhaustion. The smallest comfort was a sign of survival, not of ease. The people of these huts endured through habit, through need, and through a quiet resignation that life would not improve. They rose each morning to the same dirt, the same chill, the same ache that never left their bones. And in that endless routine lay the rhythm of the Dark Ages itself. The hut was their world, and the world was small. The straw hut offered no comfort, only endurance wrapped in mud and smoke. Beyond its doorway waited a land ruled by fear and hunger, where safety depended on luck more than strength. Somewhere outside, men were already sharpening blades, and the day had barely begun. The morning in the Dark Ages began not with light, but with the awareness of danger. The air outside the hut was sharp and cold, filled with the sounds of life waking, dogs barking, doors creaking, and somewhere the echo of a man shouting. You stepped out with the same instinctive caution every villager had, eyes darting across the muddy path, scanning for movement. It was not thieves you feared in the modern sense, but neighbors, travelers, or hungry men who had nothing left to lose. Anyone could take what you had, and the world would not care. There were no laws strong enough to protect the weak, only survival written in silence and suspicion. It is almost ironic that people feared demons and witches when the real monsters carried knives and wore familiar faces. The absence of order was not chaos to them. It was the way of things. Life existed inside small pockets of obedience, controlled by whoever held more weapons or men. The word justice was rarely spoken because it had no place here. A stolen loaf of bread might cost a hand, but a murder could pass unpunished if no one dared speak. The night invited cruelty, and the dawn only revealed what was left behind. There was no comfort in waking, only the duty to keep breathing for one more day. Travelers passing through the village were both a curiosity and a threat. Strangers meant stories, but also uncertainty. Every man carried something worth stealing, and every road was watched by eyes behind hedges and trees. Small bands of thieves moved between settlements, attacking the isolated and desperate. A single trip to fetch water could become a fight for life. Villages posted lookouts, but they were often useless. Fear itself had already settled into the bones of the people. To step outside alone was to gamble. Weapons were crude and few. Most carried sticks, knives, or farming tools turned into defense. A sharp hoe was a weapon as much as it was a tool for soil. Families slept with axes near their straw beds, ready for the sound of footsteps at night. Fear did not sleep. It was a constant hum beneath daily life, a rhythm as familiar as hunger. No one trusted easily. Even neighbors were kept at a distance because kindness could cost too much if it was misplaced. To live like this was to understand violence as normal. Blood on the ground was not shocking. It was part of the morning routine, cleaned away like mud. Children grew up watching it, learning early that weakness was dangerous. Compassion could mean loss. You protected what was yours, or you lost it. The idea of safety was foreign because danger was the only consistent thing they knew. If we were to compare it to modern life, it would be like waking up each morning knowing that the police, the law, and even your neighbors might all be waiting for a moment of your distraction. The weak learned invisibility. Women avoided eye contact with traveling men. Old people stayed indoors, and those who owned small valuables hid them in the ground. To speak of wealth was foolish. To display it was fatal. The church preached humility, and in this world, humility was survival. A full stomach could draw envy. A loaf of bread was worth more than pride. In many places, even the local lordsmen were predators, demanding food, money, or worse under the pretense of protection. The price for saying no was ruin. The fear of being robbed shaped how people lived. Doors, if they existed, were barred with stones. At night, fires were dimmed to avoid attention. Travelers avoided roads after dusk, preferring to sleep in the woods rather than risk the company of others. The danger was not from beasts or ghosts, but from men, always men, hungry and cruel, from years of want. Each morning began with counting what was left: a tool, a sack of grain, a life. Theft was not always evil, it was survival. The starving stole from the dead, from neighbors, from the church. Morality had no meaning when your child's ribs showed through their skin. There was no mercy from the world, so mercy disappeared from the people. Fear bred hardness, and hardness kept them alive. There was a kind of acceptance in it, the way people accept rain or cold. You hated it, but you lived with it, because you could not change it. Inside the villages, rumor was a weapon. A word could destroy someone faster than a sword. Whisper that a man was a thief and he might vanish by nightfall. Whisper that a woman was unlucky and no one would speak to her again. Suspicion ruled every face, every glance. There was no greater loneliness than being distrusted, but no safety and trust either. I imagine walking through one of those villages, hearing the creak of wood and the murmurs behind closed doors. The quiet would not be peaceful. It would be heavy, tense, waiting for something to happen. It is strange how fear can become ordinary when it lasts long enough until people mistake it for life itself. Every moment felt borrowed, every possession temporary. And yet somehow they endured. They built families, shared bread, and prayed that tomorrow would not take more than it already had. The morning was not a beginning, but a warning. The world outside the hut was wide, and in that space, no one cared if you lived or died. Life moved forward through habit and fear. Each day, a negotiation between hunger and danger. The mornings in those villages carried both hunger and dread, a constant reminder that safety was a dream for other ages. Behind the mud paths lay the same hunger, the same violence waiting to return by dusk. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the smell of food mixed with something bitter, and it was not always clear which one killed faster. Food in the Dark Ages was not something to look forward to. Each morning began with the same thin porridge, gray and tasteless, made from a handful of oats boiled in water that was never quite clean. It sat heavy in the bowl, if a bowl even existed, and smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood. The water was drawn from streams shared with animals, often cloudy with mud and floating debris. Still, people drank and cooked with it because there was no other choice. The porridge clung to the spoon in sticky clumps, cooling too fast in the cold air. Hunger made it easier to swallow, even when it scraped down the throat like grit. It is almost darkly funny that something so empty of flavor was treated as breakfast, as if the day deserved a ceremony at all. For the poor, this meal was both beginning and end. There was rarely bread and never butter. Salt was a treasure, meat a memory. Children licked their bowls clean, not from manners, but from the fear of wasting a single oat. The body learned to work on little, to walk and toil without strength, because the alternative was death. Some families thinned their porridge even further, stretching what little they had by adding more water. It filled the stomach, but not the need. To feel full was a luxury. To feel hungry was normal. In some villages, the luckiest might add scraps of roots or weeds pulled from the edge of fields. A sliver of onion or turnip could change the taste enough to feel like variety. The imagination did the rest. Meat appeared only on feast days when animals were slaughtered in ritual or desperation. For most of the year, people smelled meat cooking from the manor kitchens, but never tasted it. The scent itself was torture. It drifted through the air, sweet and heavy, reminding them of what they would never have. Malnutrition shaped the people as much as the climate. Their bodies were thin, bones visible through rough skin, teeth decayed, hair fell, and wounds took months to heal. Even when they worked from dawn to dusk, energy never came easily. The constant hunger dulled the mind, turning thought into a slow, heavy process. To live in this state was to exist half awake, half starved. The stomach was always whispering, the ache never gone. If one compared this to modern times, it would be like surviving on a single slice of bread a day and pretending that it counts as living. The illusion of food mattered as much as the food itself. People gathered around fires to share what they had, and for a few moments, warmth and company masked the emptiness. The act of eating together made hunger feel less cruel. Parents gave their portions to their children and smiled as if they were not starving. It was a quiet deception, born from love and necessity. Hunger was too constant to fight, so it became part of the rhythm of life. Markets did not offer salvation. Prices shifted with the weather, and a poor harvest meant starvation for entire villages. Grains were hoarded by landowners, leaving scraps for those who worked the fields. Bread, when available, was coarse and bitter, mixed with bark or ground peas to make it last longer. Some loaves were so hard they had to be soaked before eating. The line between food and survival blurred until they were the same thing. Even the drink offered no comfort. Ale was weak and often sour, brewed more for safety than pleasure. Water was dangerous. Milk was for children or lords. Adults lived on thin ale, enough to dull the hunger but not to nourish. A rare cup of fresh milk or clean water was treated like medicine. In a world of filth, purity was a myth. I imagined standing beside one of those fires, watching steam rise from a pot of thin porridge, hearing the faint bubbling that meant breakfast was almost ready. The smell would not be tempting, only familiar. Something is haunting about how people can grow used to emptiness until it feels like normal life. They did not expect more because they could not imagine more. Hope required energy, and hunger stole that too. Hunger was not a moment of need, it was a way of being. It shaped how people walked, spoke, and dreamed. It taught them humility, endurance, and quiet despair. In a world where everything belonged to someone else, even food became a form of submission. The porridge that kept them alive was also a reminder of how little control they had over their own survival. The taste of the Dark Ages was ash, smoke, and fatigue. Every bite carried the weight of scarcity, every meal an act of persistence rather than pleasure. There was no comfort in eating, only the dull relief of silence from the stomach for a little while. The morning meal did not nourish, it merely postponed suffering. As the day stretched ahead, hunger returned stronger, demanding more than the fields could give. And somewhere between the aching bellies and empty bowls, people began to dream of meat they might never taste again. The air of a Dark Age village was not something one could breathe without effort. It was thick, moist, and alive with a stench of waste that never left. Every gust carried a new layer of rot, human waste, animal dung, and stagnant mud that clung to every path and puddle. The smell was not an intrusion, but a constant presence, woven into the walls, the clothes, and even the hair of those who lived there. To walk through the village was to move inside a cloud of decay, so heavy that it numbed the senses over time. The people did not hold their breath, they simply stopped noticing.
It almost feels comedic in a cruel way. The breathing was itself a kind of endurance test. Smoke hung low over the huts, rising from every small fire that burned through the day and night. The fuel was whatever could be found, wet wood, straw, or dried dung pressed into patties. The fires produced more smoke than warmth, turning the inside of homes into choking chambers. There was no chimney, only small holes or cracks where the gray haze tried to escape. It coated the walls in black soot, darkened the ceilings, and left a bitter taste on the tongue. Children grew up with red eyes and raw throats, coughing before they could speak clearly. In many huts, the air itself looked solid. Villagers knew that smoke kept insects away and gave a sense of comfort in winter, so they tolerated it. To them, coughing was part of living. Lungs grew heavy, breath shallow, and nights were spent with wheezing that echoed softly in the dark. It was not an illness, it was normal. The idea of fresh air did not exist because there was nowhere it could be found. Forests smelled of damp and rot, fields smelled of manure, rain smelled of waste. Purity was not an expectation, it was a fantasy. The streets added their own scent to the mixture. Open ditches ran beside the paths, carrying water, refuse, and filth in one sluggish flow. Slops from cooking pots, blood from slaughtered animals, and waste from every hut found their way into the same channels. On warmer days, the air shimmered with a sour sweetness that turned the stomach. Flies gathered in black swarms, settling on food, faces, and wounds alike. Still, no one flinched. The smell was everywhere. To escape it was impossible. Inside homes, the air was worse. Fires burned all day in an effort to dry clothes and warm the damp straw. The smoke mixed with the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and rotting food. There was no ventilation, no windows to open, only the same foul breath circulating endlessly. It was darkness made physical, pressing against the lungs with every inhale. The walls trapped the heat, but also the odor, until the two became inseparable. If compared to the modern world, it would be like living inside a furnace powered by trash, calling it cozy because there was no other choice. In this air, disease thrived. The cough that began as a nuisance turned into a fever, the fever into death. People believed bad smells carried evil spirits, and in a way, they were right. The bacteria and filth floating in every breath killed more quietly than any sword. Yet no one connected the stench to sickness. They thought it was simply part of life's design, a burden meant to be carried. Even priests prayed for protection against foul air, waving incense to mask what could not be cleansed. Daily chores made it worse. The washing of hides, the burning of tallow, the boiling of animal parts for food, all sent their own fumes into the air. Smoke mixed with the scent of fat, and the combination lingered for hours. To visitors from outside, it would have been unbearable. But there were no visitors. The smell belonged to everyone, shared like hunger, accepted like pain. To complain about it was pointless. There were greater things to fear than the air. I can almost picture standing in one of those narrow lanes, surrounded by huts that exhale smoke from every crack. The ground is slick beneath my boots. The air so heavy it feels like breathing through cloth. It is strange to realize that what we now call pollution was once called life itself. The thought of clean air would have seemed childish to them, a luxury for angels or kings. They did not seek purity, they sought survival. The lungs of the Dark Ages were never empty. Each breath brought a new weight, invisible yet constant. People lived shorter lives, not only because of hunger or violence, but because every inhale was a small poison. The earth they worked, the fires they built, and the waste they left all circled back to them with each breath. The air was not an enemy, but a quiet accomplice to suffering. It filled every space, carried every sickness, and shaped every life that tried to breathe within it. The world smelled of survival, a blend of smoke, sweat, and decay that no one could escape. Each exhale joined the collective breath of the village, feeding a cycle that never truly ended. And somewhere in that gray fog of filth, life continued, as if endurance were its own kind of purity. Death was never far from the villages of the Dark Ages. It lived quietly among the people, waiting behind every cough, every fever, every wound that refused to close. The air was cold and wet, perfect for rot to linger. When plague or sickness swept through, there was no strength left for burial. The dead outnumbered the living too quickly, and the ground was too hard or too crowded to take them all. So bodies remained outside huts, beside rivers, sometimes even inside homes, until they became part of the landscape itself.
It sounds almost grotesque, but for them, stepping past the dead was as ordinary as stepping over a puddle. The smell came first, heavy and unmistakable, a mixture of decay and damp soil. People tried to mask it with smoke or herbs, but nothing could hide it for long.
Corpses bloated under the sun, their outlines softening until they were no longer people, just shapes that the wind disturbed. Flies swarmed so thickly that the air itself seemed alive. Dogs and rats feasted without fear, their bellies swelling from human flesh. It was not cruelty, only the balance of hunger. The living could not afford disgust. They had to keep moving, even as death brushed their ankles. When the disease came, it spread faster than understanding. A fever could take a village in days. The sick were isolated, but isolation meant abandonment. A person left in a hut to die often stayed there long after, their body stiff and pale until someone dared to drag it away. No priest came to bless them, no bell rang. The rituals of death were luxuries that required time, and time was scarce. Those still standing were already digging shallow graves for others. The rivers became graveyards of convenience. Bodies were rolled down muddy banks into the water, carried away with the current or washed ashore a mile later. Sometimes they gathered at bends in the stream, swelling into grim clusters. Children threw stones at them, not out of malice, but out of the numb familiarity that death created. The current was slow, and the water dark with silt and rot. Yet people still drank from it. There was no other source. The line between water and grave blurred until they were the same thing. Even the fields bore witness. Shallow pits filled too fast, and the next rain uncovered what had been buried. White bones glinted among the weeds. Skulls stared upward as if watching the clouds. Farmers worked around them, their shovels hitting ribs and spines as if they were stones. Death was not a secret, it was a neighbor. People spoke of it without emotion, as if it were weather. If compared to modern life, it would be like walking through your own street and finding the evidence of yesterday's funerals lying in the open, too common to notice. The fear was not of ghosts, but of infection. No one knew how the disease spread, but everyone knew it traveled with bodies. Touching the dead meant risking your own life. Yet, someone always had to do it. Often it was the poorest, the ones whose hunger outweighed their fear. They dragged corpses by ropes or wrapped in cloth, moving them just far enough away to make breathing possible again. They worked quickly, without words, without prayer. When they finished, they burned their own clothes and prayed not for peace, but for survival. In some places, the churchyards overflowed. Graves collapsed into one another, and bones surfaced from the earth after every storm. The bells of mourning rang so often that people stopped listening. Death had lost its ceremony. There was no mourning left to give. Families grieved silently, then returned to the same soil that would one day take them too. Children played near graves, not because they were fearless, but because they had never known a world without death. I imagine standing on one of those narrow roads, the mud thick and dark, the air full of flies, and the faint hum of decay. The sound of crows circling above would be the only music. It is unsettling how human beings can accept horror when it becomes routine, how the unbearable slowly turns into the background of life. The villagers did not see corpses anymore. They saw reminders of what they already expected, that life was brief and endings were everywhere. Death was not an interruption to life, but a part of its rhythm. Every cough carried a warning, every meal a question of whether it might be the last. To live in such a world was to carry grief like a second skin, worn and familiar. People laughed, worked, and slept beside decay because ignoring it was the only way to stay sane. The path to survival was narrow, winding between sickness and apathy. Those who endured did so not because they were brave, but because they had forgotten how to fear. Death no longer shocked them. It simply confirmed what they already knew. The village smelled of the dead, yet life went on, weaving itself through rot and ruin. Each sunrise rose over the same fields of shallow graves, the same crows that watched from above. Somewhere in that stillness, hunger began again, as if even death could not interrupt the routine of need. Bare feet were a fact of life in the Dark Ages, as ordinary as hunger or cold. Leather shoes existed, but only for those who could pay for them, and most never could. For the poor, the earth itself became both ground and garment, and their feet bore the weight of every season without protection. The mud of the village paths clung to the skin like a second layer, thick and cold, filled with stones, thorns, and shards of bone. To step outside each morning was to face the same punishment, repeated endlessly. The soil was never dry, never kind, and it swallowed warmth faster than fire could give it. It is grimly amusing that the poorest people in history left no footprints, only wounds. Children learned early that pain was part of walking. Their souls hardened over time, growing rough and cracked until they resembled the bark of trees. But the cold always found a way in. During winter, frostbitten toes turned pale and stiff, sometimes black, sometimes lost entirely. People limped through their lives, their bodies adapting, not through comfort but through endurance. They did not stop because stopping meant freezing where they stood. Every step was a negotiation between movement and pain. The paths themselves were traps. Broken pottery, splinters, and rusted nails lay hidden under layers of mud. The refuse of daily life was thrown everywhere, and with no shoes to guard against it, every cut carried danger. Infection came silently, swelling first the toes, then the leg, then the whole body. A single wound could end a life, not through violence but through decay. There were no healers for the poor, only advice to keep moving and pray that the swelling would fade. For many, it never did. Feet were symbols of survival. They carried people to fields, to rivers, to markets, through frost and filth. The skin cracked so deeply that blood mixed with mud, forming dark patterns that never washed away. Even when the pain was constant, there was no complaint. The idea of comfort did not exist. What mattered was movement, and movement meant life. If one compares it to the present day, it would be like walking barefoot through broken glass every morning and calling it routine. When the cold grew unbearable, people wrapped rags around their feet, tying them with rope or strips of linen. The fabric soaked quickly, freezing into stiff bands that made walking even harder. Some used straw for insulation, though it offered little warmth. On rare occasions, travelers might find an old boot discarded by someone richer, worn down to holes, yet still a treasure. A single shoe was better than none, and it might be shared among family members for the harshest tasks. The ground itself was never clean. Every step pressed into layers of waste from humans and animals alike. Roads were paths of rot, slick with dung and ashes. The mud was not just earth, but a mixture of every foul thing that fell upon it. To walk through it meant carrying the smell home, where it joined the smoke and sweat that already filled the air. Even sleep offered no escape, for the same mud dried against skin and straw, turning rest into another form of discomfort. Feet bore witness to everything the Dark Ages demanded. They were calloused testaments to labor, scarred proof of endurance. Women worked the fields with the same bare feet that carried them through childbirth. Men marched to war with souls that had never known leather. Every step left a trace of exhaustion behind, a silent record of a life lived against the elements. To look down at one's feet was to see the history of one's suffering written plainly, without pride or shame. I imagine standing at the edge of a medieval field, watching the villagers tread barefoot across frost-covered ground. The earth crunches beneath them, the air biting at their ankles, and yet they continue without pause. It is unsettling how the human body learns to accept cruelty when it has no other choice. They do not curse the cold nor question it. To them, numbness is protection, and endurance is all that remains of dignity. The seasons offered no mercy. In summer, the mud baked into dust that sliced the skin open with every step. In autumn, rain returned to soften it into sludge, thick enough to steal a person's footing. Winter froze it into stone, sharp and unyielding. Spring only began the cycle again.
The feet that carried people through these changes were as much a tool as their hands, and like tools, they broke. Yet no one thought of replacing them, for there was nothing else to walk upon but the same cruel earth. The body adjusted as it always does. Pain became part of balance. Cold became part of breathing. The villagers did not count steps or distances, for everything they walked toward was the same work, hunger, and the faint hope of survival. In the grand story of the Dark Ages, no one wrote about feet, but they were the first to meet every hardship and the last to rest. Barefoot life was not romantic or natural. It was a necessity disguised as a habit. Pain turned invisible through repetition. The dirt between their toes was the same dirt they slept upon, the same dirt that would one day cover them completely. The ground was both cradle and coffin, demanding flesh as payment for every mile. Each footprint vanished in the next rain, leaving only silence and scars. Under that silence, the earth waited patiently, knowing that sooner or later it would no longer need to let them go. There were no toilets in the villages of the Dark Ages, only a pit dug into the earth behind the hill, shared by everyone who lived nearby. It was not hidden, not covered, and not protected from the weather. The ground around it was soft and dark from years of use. The air above it heavy with a smell that never faded. To approach it was to be reminded that privacy did not exist, that even the most basic act of living was a public burden. The pit gaped open like a wound in the land, steaming faintly in the cold air, surrounded by buzzing flies that never left. It is almost absurd that civilization could speak of faith and honor while its people crouched together over the same hole. The smell clung to everything. It floated through the village, caught in the wind, and mixed with the smoke of the cooking fires. No matter how far one walked, it followed, a ghost that belonged to everyone. In summer, when the heat rose, the odor thickened until it felt alive. The buzzing of flies became constant, a thin and maddening sound. Children played nearby because they had nowhere else to go, their bare feet tracking filth back into the huts. Adults no longer noticed. The stench was part of breathing, part of being alive. At night, the pit became a place of risk. To use it was to walk through darkness filled with whispers and shadows. The ground was uneven, slippery from rain and waste. Sometimes people fell. Sometimes animals found their way in. There was fear not only of shame, but of danger itself. Wild dogs prowled the edge, and rats hid beneath the earth. Still, the villagers went because they had to. There was no other choice. The thought of comfort or cleanliness did not belong to their world. Water for washing was scarce, and soap was rare. People wiped themselves with handfuls of grass or leaves, sometimes with nothing at all. The hands that cleaned also kneaded bread, washed children, and tended to the sick. Disease traveled easily through touch, through shared tools, through the same hands that worked the fields and shared food. They did not know why sickness spread, only that it did. The pit was both necessary and deadly, a reminder that the line between life and rot was impossibly thin. When the hole was filled, another was dug beside it, and the old one was left to dry in the sun. No one marked it, no one fenced it off. The ground became layered with generations of waste, and when rain fell, it carried the filth downhill into the same streams used for drinking and cooking. The cycle was unbroken, invisible in its routine. People lived surrounded by their own decay, yet they called it normal. If one were to compare it to modern times, it would be like an entire neighborhood sharing a single open sewer and calling it nature's design. Some tried to avoid the communal pit altogether, hiding behind bushes or walls. But privacy was a privilege the poor could not afford. The land was open, the huts too small, and the need too frequent. The body did not wait for convenience. In the early mornings, the faint silhouettes of villagers could be seen moving across the fields, each carrying the same quiet shame, crouching quickly before returning to daily chores. It was a routine stripped of dignity, performed in silence. Flies thrived in this world. They swarmed not only around the pit, but over the cooking pots, over wounds, over the faces of children too weak to swat them away. Their legs carried everything from waste to food, from death to life.
The villagers saw them as an annoyance, not a threat, because they could not imagine otherwise. The same creatures that feasted on rot also landed on their meals, and still they ate. Habit dulled disgust until nothing shocked them anymore. The church preached cleanliness of the soul, not of the body. Priests warned against sin, but said nothing of sanitation. To them, the pit was simply part of life's design, another trial sent by God. People prayed for strong stomachs more often than for salvation. The filth beneath their feet was accepted as fate, as inescapable as hunger or cold. The smell of waste became the scent of existence itself. I can almost picture standing by that hill, watching the faint mist rise as the sun touches the damp earth.
The sound of flies hums like a strange hymn, the kind that marks the rhythm of life and death together. It is disturbing how quickly the human mind accepts filth when it has no alternative. To the villagers, it was not horror, but habit, not shame, but necessity. The body demanded what the world refused to make easy. The pit behind the hill was more than a place. It was a truth. It showed how close people lived to what they tried to ignore, how survival blurred the line between the human and the animal. There was no separation, no illusion of control, only endurance. Each sunrise brought the same sight, the same smell, the same dull acceptance that this was life. The hill behind the village stood as a silent witness, holding the proof of generations who never knew relief. The hill behind the huts breathed with the waste of the living, a quiet monument to their endurance. The flies rose with the dawn, the smell spread with the wind, and the earth absorbed what it was given. In that decay, life continued, pretending that the filth was simply part of being human. Toothache in the Dark Ages was not a small discomfort, but a slow form of torture that everyone expected to endure. There were no dentists, no soothing remedies, and no understanding of infection. The pain began as a dull throb somewhere deep in the jaw, and then spread like fire through the head. Sleep became impossible, and eating unbearable. A simple cavity could ruin weeks, even months of life. Yet it was considered ordinary, no more deserving of sympathy than hunger or cold. It almost feels comical in the darkest way that something as small as a tooth could decide whether a person could live or die. There was no toothpaste, no brushes, no clean water to rinse with. People rubbed ashes or salt across their teeth, grinding more enamel away than they cleaned. The grit from these mixtures cut the gums, letting infection enter. Rot grew slowly, quietly, until it reached the roots. The smell of decay filled mouths and homes alike. Breath turned sour and metallic, but no one remarked on it because everyone shared it. The mouth was a map of neglect, every blackened tooth a mark of poverty. When the pain became unbearable, the only cure was removal. Iron pliers, kitchen tongs, or even fingers wrapped in cloth were used to wrench teeth free. There was no anesthesia, no preparation, no mercy. The scream that followed was not a sign of failure, but proof of effort. Blood ran freely, mixing with dirt, and the wound was left to close on its own. The lucky ones survived with swollen faces and missing teeth. The unlucky ones developed fevers that burned for days until the infection reached their hearts. In those villages, death often began in the mouth. The cause of the decay was not only neglect, but also diet. Bread was coarse, mixed with grit and small stones from the millstones that ground the grain. Every bite wore away enamel. People chewed tough meat when they could find it, drank sour ale that eroded what little protection they had. Sugar was rare, but rot came easily anyway. The body, weakened by constant hunger, could not fight infection. A bad tooth was more dangerous than a wound in battle. Tooth pain shaped faces. The old were toothless long before their hair turned gray, their mouths sunken and twisted. Speech slurred, chewing became impossible, and starvation often followed. Children grew up seeing this and accepted it as the future waiting for them. The idea of a full set of teeth was as distant as owning gold. They smiled rarely, not out of modesty, but because smiling hurt. If one compares it to the modern world, it would be like living every day with shards of glass in your gums, and no one thinks that is strange. Some people turned to folk healers who offered charms, prayers, and potions that stank of herbs and alcohol. They tied threads to the aching tooth and pulled sharply, believing the pain would leave with the root. Others burned their gums with a hot iron to kill the spirit of pain. Some pressed garlic, vinegar, or even urine into their mouths, desperate for relief. None of it worked for long. The agony always returned, and when it did, it came back angrier. At night, the sound of groaning was common. A man clutching his face, rocking back and forth beside a cold hearth. A mother was unable to nurse her child because her jaw was swollen shut. The pain robbed people of reason. It made them lash out, curse, or weep without words. The village had no pity to spare. Everyone was suffering from something. The toothache became just another noise in a world already full of misery. Infections spread quickly. A single abscess could swell until it closed the throat. People choked slowly, unable to breathe. Their faces puffed and purple. Families watched without understanding, afraid to touch. The priest would arrive too late, holding a cross instead of medicine. The burial came soon after. In the records, such deaths were listed simply as fever. The mouth was never mentioned. I can imagine standing in one of those huts, hearing someone gasp through pain, their jaw clenched tight, the smell of blood and smoke filling the air. The firelight catches on the iron pliers beside them, still wet from their last use. It is difficult to accept how ordinary agony was for them. How the body was expected to break piece by piece without protest. Pain was not treated, it was tolerated. And tolerance in that world was mistaken for strength. Teeth were not just bones, they were reminders of the body's slow surrender. Each one lost was another step toward weakness, another reason to eat less, work less, and live shorter. The mouth, once used for speech, laughter, and song, became a chamber of rot and silence. There was no vanity left to protect, only the dull pride of enduring. The Dark Ages offered no mercy for pain that could not be seen, no cure for what grew beneath the surface. Each tooth that fell or was torn away marked another victory for decay. The people carried on with bleeding gums and hollow cheeks, never questioning why life hurt so much. The sound of teeth cracking under iron echoed softly across the villages, a grim hymn to endurance. Blood dried on wooden floors, and pain lingered like a prayer unanswered. Somewhere outside, a child bit into hard bread, and the cycle began again. War came without warning in the Dark Ages, carried on rumors that traveled faster than horses. One morning, you might wake as a farmer, and by sunrise, you were a soldier. There was no ceremony, no choice. The Lord's men arrived on horseback, calling names, taking whoever could still hold a tool or a stick. Refusing meant punishment, and punishment meant death. The fields were left half-plowed, the animals untended, as men were pulled from their lives and pushed toward battles they did not understand. It is strangely tragic that a man could spend his life growing food, only to die feeding the ground with his own blood. There was no training, no promise of armor. Most who were taken fought in the same clothes they worked in. A wooden spear, a dull blade, or a broken shield was all they received. Some carried farming tools sharpened overnight. Scythes turned into weapons that bent after one blow. They were told to stand in lines, to move forward when ordered, to die quietly if necessary. The soldiers around them were strangers gathered from villages miles apart. Fear hung thick between them, heavier than the armor they never had. When the battle began, the noise was overwhelming. Steel clashed against bone. Men screamed and horses screamed louder. The air was filled with dust, blood, and the smell of iron. There was no strategy, only chaos. Those in front fell first, trampled by those behind. The cries for help were swallowed by the roar of war drums and the shouting of commands that no one could hear. The sky itself seemed to shake.
The farmer who once bent over crops now knelt in mud that was not soil but blood, and still he swung his weapon because stopping meant dying sooner. Those who survived the first hour rarely survived the second. Wounds festered before they could heal, and thirst turned their mouths black. There were no medics, no bandages, no mercy. If you fell, you were left where you landed. Flies came before priests, crows before prayers. The lucky ones died quickly. The rest spent their final hours staring at the clouds, listening to the sounds of others dying nearby. The battlefield became a harvest of bodies, cut down by men who had once harvested grain. When the fighting ended, the survivors were not heroes. They were walking corpses, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling from exhaustion. They returned to their villages to find their homes looted, their families gone, their fields ruined. There was no reward, no recognition. The Lord gained new land, and the peasants gained new graves. War did not end for them, it simply changed location. The same mud that clung to their boots in the fields now stuck to their wounds. They were ghosts among the living, too grief-stricken to speak. If one compares it to today, it would be like being dragged from your job and handed a weapon you do not know how to use, told to fight for a cause you cannot name. But power of the lords was absolute. Their word was law, and their needs outweighed every life below them. Men were taken to fight wars of pride, religion, or revenge that meant nothing to those who died for them. A peasant's life was measured not by years, but by usefulness. When the Lord needed soldiers, they became soldiers. When he needed farmers, they became farmers again. If they lived long enough to return, the value of a man was as temporary as his heartbeat. The villagers mourned quietly. Women waited for husbands who never came home. Mothers buried sons without knowing where they had fallen. Children grew up with a memory of a voice that once promised to come back. The church called these deaths noble sacrifices, but there was nothing noble in a corpse left unburied on a foreign hill. War was not glory, it was arithmetic. How many men could die before the land stopped producing? In the rare moments of peace, the scars remained. The smell of blood did not wash off easily, and the nightmares never left. Men woke screaming in the night, seeing again the faces of those they had killed or failed to save. They drank to forget, but memory clung like mud. The village learned to recognize the hollow look of survivors, eyes that had seen too much and mouths that said too little. I can almost imagine standing beside them on the battlefield after the noises faded, the silence broken only by the buzzing of flies, the ground still warm from the bodies, the air thick with the taste of iron. It is hard to believe that history calls this bravery when it was mostly fear given a name. The peasants did not fight for faith or honor, they fought because they were told to. War was not an event but a routine. The lords needed it to prove power, the priests to preach purpose, and the poor to fill graves. Every time it ended, it waited to begin again. For those who lived through it, survival felt like failure because the dead no longer had to return to the fields. The sound of marching feet never truly left the villages. Even after the battles ended, the earth remembered. The same soil that grew their crops fed on their blood, and life continued as it always did, unaware of how much death it carried beneath. The Lord's orders turned farmers into soldiers, and soldiers into memories before the season changed. The fields where they once planted grain became their resting place, marked by nothing but silence. In the distance, the clang of metal rose again, and the wind carried the faint promise that another call to arms was already coming. Women in the Dark Ages did not belong to themselves. They were born as possessions, transferred like coins between fathers, husbands, and lords. A daughter could be traded for land, a wife exchanged for livestock, a widow forced into marriage again to settle a debt. Her worth was measured not by her thoughts or strength, but by how much she could offer, how much she could endure, and how quietly she could do both. It is bitterly ironic that the same men who prayed for virtue in women treated them as goods to be bartered. Marriage was rarely a union of love, but a contract of survival. Girls were promised before they were grown, handed to men twice their age because their families could not afford otherwise. The ceremony, if one existed, was more transaction than celebration. Rings and vows meant less than the animals tied outside as payment. Once inside her husband's house, a woman ceased to exist as an individual. She became property, both tool and ornament, expected to obey, to labor, and to bear children until her body failed. There was no refuge from violence. A man could strike his wife, starve her, even kill her, and still be seen as righteous. The law called it discipline, not cruelty. The church preached obedience and patience, telling women that suffering was holy, that endurance brought them closer to salvation. For those who resisted, there was shame, gossip, or punishment. No door opened for them, no ear listened. The silence around their pain was thicker than the walls of their homes. Rape was common, yet rarely spoken of. It was not seen as a crime against the woman, but as an offense against the man who owned her. A lord could take a servant, a soldier could take a peasant's wife, and nothing would change. The victim was left with bruises, perhaps a child, and was always blamed. Villagers whispered about impurity, not violence. The priest told her to confess as though she were the sinner. There was no justice, only endurance disguised as morality. Even within marriage, consent was a foreign idea. A wife's body belonged to her husband, and refusal was sin. Nights were long, quiet, and heavy, filled with acts that no one named aloud. Women learned to separate their minds from their bodies, to think of other things, while their husbands took what they claimed was theirs. They endured because endurance was expected. They gave birth in pain, raised children in hunger, and were buried in unmarked graves. Their names rarely made it onto parchment. But their labor built every stone of the world they were denied. The home which was supposed to shelter them was a cage. A woman's life unfolded between the hearth and the field, between orders and silence. She cooked, washed, mended, and served, her hands always working and her eyes always lowered. Even her clothing marked her submission, layers of rough cloth that covered her completely, as though hiding her could erase her existence. Her body was never her own, and her spirit was not supposed to wander. For widows, life was no kinder. Without a husband, they lost protection, income, and respect. The same villagers who once called them pious began to see them as burdens or temptations. Some were forced to remarry, others starved. A few entered convents, trading one form of servitude for another. Freedom was a word without meaning. A woman was always owned by something, a man, a family, or God. If one compares it to the modern world, it would be like living your entire life as someone else's signature on a contract you never agreed to sign. The stories that survive from that time rarely speak of women directly. They appear as wives, mothers, or witches, always defined by how they affected men. Yet behind every account of conquest or labor, there were women tending wounds, burying the dead, feeding children, and bearing the weight of a civilization that ignored them. History remembers kings who conquered lands, but forgets the wives they sold to pay for it. I can almost see one of them now, standing by a doorway of wattle and mud, her face half hidden by a scarf, her hands raw from washing clothes in freezing water. She watches her husband ride away, not knowing if he will return, and feels neither grief nor relief, only the dull ache of habit. It is haunting how easily half of humanity can be erased by the world it sustains. Their suffering was quiet, their strength unrecorded, but both shaped the age more deeply than any crown. The life of a woman in those centuries was not her own story, but the background of everyone else's. She worked until her body broke, gave until there was nothing left to give, and when she died, the world simply continued. Their endurance was both survival and tragedy, proof of how much a person can bear when stripped of freedom and recognition. Beneath the surface of that silent obedience was a strength the world never thanked. The women of the Dark Ages lived unseen, their pain accepted as the cost of order. Each dawn found them at the same hearth, their faces lit by the same dim glow of duty.
Somewhere beyond the reach of their voices, the world they held together kept turning, never once wondering what it owed them. In the Dark Ages, the Church ruled not only the soul but the body. Every moment of existence passed under its silent permission. To be born, to marry, to die, all required approval from men in robes who claimed to speak for God. Life itself was a contract signed in fear. The church bells dictated time, the priest dictated thought, and the people obeyed because they had been taught that disobedience led not to punishment, but to eternal fire. It is grimly amusing that salvation cost money, obedience, and sometimes even your life.
There was no part of daily life untouched by the church. A man could not wed without its blessing, nor bury his dead without its rites. Even the smallest joys were measured by religious approval. The priest's word carried more weight than the Lord's sword. People confessed sins they did not understand, repeating prayers in a language they could not speak, trusting that it might keep them safe from a fate worse than death. The church promised heaven, but only if you paid and suffered enough to deserve it. Fear was its most faithful servant. The idea of sin clung to everything: hunger, sickness, lust, curiosity. A woman who gave birth outside wedlock was damned. A man who doubted a priest's words was cursed. The people lived beneath an invisible ceiling of guilt. Every cough could be divine punishment. Every crop failure a sign of moral weakness. Confession became survival, and repentance replaced reasoning. The church did not need soldiers. Belief itself was the weapon. Heresy was the word that ended lives. To question Scripture was to invite the stake. To think differently was to risk the flames. People whispered their doubts only in darkness, where even walls could not hear. The fires that burned heretics lit up the night skies of entire towns. Villagers gathered to watch, their faces blank, half in horror, half in relief that it was not them. The condemned screamed prayers to the same God that their executioners invoked. Faith and fear became indistinguishable, both fed by smoke and heat. Priests walked through villages like judges disguised as shepherds. Their robes were heavy, their eyes colder than the crosses they carried. They decided who could marry, who could speak, and who could live. A slip of the tongue, a wrong gesture could lead to ruin.
To fall out of favor with the church was to lose not only salvation, but existence itself. Those accused of witchcraft or blasphemy often vanished into cells beneath monasteries where they confessed under pain, then disappeared completely. The church recorded their guilt, never their names. For the poor, the church was both comfort and chain. It offered food during famine, but demanded obedience in return. The priests preached humility, urging the hungry to be grateful for their suffering. They promised paradise to those who accepted misery quietly. The idea that life could be better without divine permission never occurred to most. If one compares it to the modern world, it would be like needing a signed letter from a preacher just to breathe without guilt. Superstition filled every gap that knowledge could not. Lightning meant divine anger. Deformity meant sin, and madness meant possession. Priests performed exorcisms on the sick, prayers on the dying, and blessings on the weapons of men who killed for kings. The same hands that held the Bible also held the whip. The power of the church was absolute because it spoke with the voice of heaven, and the people were too afraid to listen to another. Money sanctified everything. Families paid for forgiveness, for baptisms, for burials. Even the poor scraped together coins to buy prayers for the souls of the dead. The richer you were, the shorter your stay in purgatory, or so they were told. The church grew fat on fear, its stone walls rising higher while the huts around it crumbled. The cross on the hill watched over all, not as comfort but as a warning. Inside those stone walls, candles flickered and incense drifted, masking the smell of death that clung to the altars. People knelt on cold floors, their knees bleeding as they whispered their sins. The sound of weeping echoed off the stone, blending with the chanting of priests. No one dared look up. The painted eyes of saints followed them, reminding them that even silence could be judged. The church did not simply rule, it occupied the human mind, teaching people to police themselves before anyone else could. I can imagine standing among those worshippers, the air thick with smoke and fear, the priest's voice rising above the murmurs like thunder, every word a command, every prayer a confession. It is unsettling how easily power can disguise itself as holiness, how submission can feel like faith when there is no other choice. People believed because not believing was unthinkable. They obeyed because rebellion was a death sentence. The church turned obedience into virtue and fear into salvation. It built heaven high above the reach of the poor and placed hell directly beneath their feet. Life was not lived, it was borrowed under divine supervision. The villagers walked out of the chapel each Sunday, heads bowed, their souls lighter, only because they had been reminded of how heavy they were. They did not question the order of things because the church taught them that questioning was sin. The bells of the church marked time, not life, echoing across villages that had forgotten their own voices. The smoke of burnt heretics still lingered over the hills, a faint reminder of what disobedience cost. And somewhere beneath those same bells, a new rumor began to stir, one that whispered of madness disguised as mercy. Madness in the Dark Ages was not an illness, it was a curse. The mind that faltered was seen as a doorway for demons. Not a victim of pain, but a vessel of evil. Those who lost themselves to confusion, voices, or despair were not treated but feared. Villagers crossed themselves when they passed the mad, whispering prayers as if words could block infection. There were no hospitals, no doctors, only fear and superstition wrapped in the authority of faith. It is grimly absurd that mercy was expressed through chains. The mad were locked away in cages built for animals, iron bars and straw for bedding, filth for company. Some were tied in barns beside pigs, their cries mixing with grunts and squeals. The line between man and beast blurred until it disappeared. Families that could not afford confinement simply abandoned their kin, leaving them to wander, starve, or freeze. Madness was a shame that spread from one name to an entire bloodline. The villagers avoided them, not out of cruelty, but out of terror, believing a single glance could bring corruption. Those who were not chained were mocked. The fool became both entertainment and warning, a reminder of what happened to those who angered God. Children threw stones, priests sprinkled holy water, and the afflicted laughed or screamed without understanding why. Some were paraded through villages in ropes, beaten to drive out spirits. Others were drowned in rivers or burned under the belief that their suffering purified the soul. The crowd called it healing, though no one ever survived it. Inside monasteries, things were no kinder. The church saw madness as possession and treated it with violence disguised as faith. Monks recited prayers while holding down the screaming patient, forcing bitter herbs or boiling water between their lips. The more the body convulsed, the more convinced they became that the devil was being expelled. When the body stopped moving, they said the spirit had been freed. Death was counted as success. No one questioned the logic. The tools of this healing were cruel in their simplicity. Chains, sticks, cold water, fasting. Isolation was considered medicine. Those who muttered to themselves were locked alone in the dark. Their only company, the rats that crept through the straw. Hunger and silence did what prayers could not. They broke what was left of the mind. When the door finally opened, a person might crawl out half-blind, trembling, too weak to speak. The villagers nodded in approval, calling it a recovery. If one compares it to today, it would be like treating sorrow with beatings and calling the bruises proof of progress. There was no understanding of despair, grief, or trauma. Women who cried too often after childbirth were said to be possessed. Men who refused to work were called lazy sinners. The mad were not seen as suffering, but as warnings, reminders to obey, to stay silent, to stay within the boundaries of faith. To feel too deeply was dangerous. To think too differently was fatal. The mind had no right to rebellion. Rumors grew around those afflicted. Some were said to speak with ghosts, others to predict storms or deaths. Fear turned them into legends, and legends justified cruelty. They were beaten, exiled, or kept alive in corners of barns, fed scraps by the same hands that fed the pigs. On cold nights, their bodies were found frozen in ditches, faces twisted, not by madness, but by cold and hunger. The villagers buried them without names, whispering that the devil had finally left. The few who survived long enough to grow old did so by hiding. They learned silence, pretending to be sane by copying the gestures of others. A quiet stare, a forced smile, a bowed head. They lived as shadows, their minds fading behind their eyes. Some were even praised for being healed, though the healing was nothing more than exhaustion. They no longer screamed because they no longer had voices. I can imagine standing before one of those cages, the stench of straw and sweat thick in the air, the sound of someone muttering in the corner, half human, half forgotten. The priest passes by without looking, tossing a few drops of holy water into the dark. It is haunting how fear can turn suffering into spectacle, how pity dies when people believe they are serving something holy. In that world, cruelty was not the opposite of compassion, it was its disguise. The madness that frightened them was often born of the same hunger, grief, and loss that they all endured. The mind simply broke first, and the rest called it sin. There was no word for trauma, no patience for sorrow. They could not see that the demons they tried to cast out were of their own making. The cries of the mad filled the same air as church bells and animal calls, blending into the daily noise of life. People grew used to it, just as they grew used to dirt, disease, and death. The sound of suffering was not strange, it was part of the rhythm of existence. The cages stood at the edge of the villages, rusted and wet, their bars etched with the scratches of hands that never stopped fighting. When the wind blew through them, it carried voices that no one wanted to hear. And in that hollow sound, you could almost mistake despair for prayer. A cough in the Dark Ages was never just a cough. It began as a small sound in the throat, a dry ache after a cold morning, something too ordinary to fear. Yet within days, the lungs filled with heaviness. Each breath became shorter, and warmth turned to fever. The air itself felt thick, and every inhale scraped against the ribs like sandpaper. People did not think of germs or infection, only of punishment, the body rebelling because of sin. It is darkly absurd that death could begin with something as simple as clearing one's throat. There were no doctors, only healers who relied on superstition and chance. They came carrying jars of herbs, charms, and sometimes animal blood. A dog's blood, they said, could drive away the sickness, as if one life could balance another. They bled the weak to cure weakness, starved the hungry to cleanse impurity. Those who survived did so not because of medicine, but because their bodies refused to surrender. The rest coughed themselves to death in silence, their chests rattling through the night until the sound stopped. The houses trapped sickness the way walls trapped smoke. Families slept close, breathing the same air, sharing the same cough. When one fell ill, the rest followed like a slow procession. Mothers wrapped their children in blankets that reeked of sweat and sickness, whispering prayers they barely believed. The floor grew damp with the water spilled from fevered hands, and the smell of rot crept in as lungs filled with fluid. When death came, it came quietly. The dying stopped coughing first, then stopped breathing altogether. There was no medicine to stop it, no cure to buy, no hope to ask for. People tried to fight the fever with herbs soaked in ale, with smoke blown through straw, with warm ashes pressed against the chest. The pain deepened anyway. Skin turned pale, lips purple, and eyes clouded with the dull sheen of surrender. The graveyard waited behind every cough, patient and certain. If one compares it to the present, it would be like dying of a cold because the world decided you were too poor to deserve antibiotics. Even small wounds carried the same threat. A splinter, a scrape, a cut from a farming tool could swell overnight, the skin reddening, heat spreading through the limb. There was no understanding of infection, no knowledge of how to stop it. The healer's cure was to drain the wound or smear it with animal fat. Some used mixtures of vinegar and ashes. Others rubbed in earth to draw out bad spirits. The result was almost always the same: pain, fever, and a slow fading of life. Death was not loud, it was steady, predictable, ordinary. Disease shaped every breath of that age. Winter brought colds that turned to death. Spring brought floods that carried sickness, and summer's warmth only fed the decay. People did not expect to live long, so they did not fear dying. A short life was not a tragedy. It was the way of things. The few who lived into old age were not symbols of strength, but of luck. Survival depended less on care and more on chance. The sick were not isolated. There was nowhere to send them. They stayed among the living, coughing through meals, sleeping beside their families. Villages became quiet cemeteries, the sound of hacking echoing between the huts like a warning. When someone finally died, the body was carried out by those who were already sick, their breathing shallow, their faces blank. There were no doctors to explain, no priests to comfort, only the same cold air that had started it all. The fear of sickness did not come from pain, but from helplessness. To fall ill was to lose control completely, to feel the body become a stranger.
The chest tightened, the lungs refused to obey, and the mind drifted in and out of fever dreams. Sometimes the sick begged to die before they drowned in their own breath. The family could only watch. There were no choices, only waiting. I can picture one of those huts at dusk, the fire dying low, the air thick with the sound of a child coughing against a mother's shoulder. Outside, frost gathers on the roof, and the wind presses against the walls as if listening. The mother's eyes are hollow, her lips moving in prayer. It is horrifying how silence can feel like mercy when all you have heard for days is the sound of someone trying to breathe. In that world, compassion was useless because love could not cure what it could not understand. Every sickness left its mark on the survivors. Those who lived carried scars on their lungs, weakness in their limbs, and fear in their minds. They spoke softly, as if loud voices might anger the air itself. They saw death not as a thief, but as a neighbor, visiting as often as hunger or cold. To be alive in such a time was to know fragility intimately. Every breath was a gamble, every shiver a warning. The human body was not an ally, but an uncertain companion, turning against its owner without reason. People prayed for strong lungs, as others prayed for rain. Both were granted only sometimes. The cough that began as an annoyance often ended as an epitaph. The huts filled with silence. The fields gained another grave, and life continued as if nothing had changed. Yet somewhere in the still air, that same cough lingered, waiting for the next breath to carry it onward. Water in the Dark Ages was a mirror of life itself, murky, still, and full of decay. It flowed through the villages, carrying mud, waste, and the remains of everything that once breathed. People cupped it in their hands and drank without hesitation because there was no alternative. Wells were rare. Rainwater turned foul within days, and thirst was stronger than disgust. The taste was metallic and sour, but it was water, and that was enough to survive another day. It is grimly ironic that what kept them alive was also what slowly killed them. Every sip carried unseen things: worms, parasites, rotting matter from upstream. Dead animals floated near the banks, swollen and still, their fur tangled with weeds. Sometimes human bodies drifted too, washed down from other villages after storms or wars. The river did not distinguish between the living and the dead. It accepted everything. Yet each morning people gathered there again, filling their buckets, washing their faces, baptizing their children in the same current that carried disease. The stench of decay mixed with a smell of wet earth, creating an odor that clung to the air like memory. Boiling water was a luxury, not a habit. Firewood was too precious to waste on safety. Most drank it raw, cloudy with sediment that settled at the bottom of their cups. Children scooped handfuls to cool themselves in summer, swallowing filth without knowing. The weaker ones sickened first. Their stomachs swelled, their skin turned gray, and their eyes dulled with fever. But no one questioned the cause. Everyone was sick, so sickness felt normal. It was simply the price of thirst. The rivers were the veins of the land, pulsing with life and rot alike. Villagers washed their clothes, bathed their animals, and emptied their waste into the same stream. The water darkened with use, yet no one thought to separate the clean from the dirty. They believed the current carried sin away, not realizing it only moved it downstream. If one compares it to today, it would be like drinking from a toilet and calling it holy because everyone else does the same. The church sometimes blessed the rivers, sprinkling them with holy water to make them pure again. But blessings did not remove the filth. The faithful dipped their hands in trusting faith to cleanse what fire could not. Even the priests drank from the same sources, believing illness to be divine judgment rather than contamination. When someone fell ill with cramps or vomiting, they prayed for forgiveness instead of treatment. The spirit was blamed for the failures of the body. In some places, people dug shallow pits near the riverbank, hoping the ground would filter the water. It did not. Mud and worms seeped through, turning every mouthful into a gamble. When the rains came, everything ran together: waste, blood, and dirt. The stream swelled, carrying death to every door after floods. The smell of decay hung for days, but the thirst was patient. It always waited for people to return. Children learned early not to ask where the water came from. They drank what they were given, their bellies full and their bodies empty of strength. Mothers wiped their mouths with rags, murmuring comfort, though they knew comfort meant little. The same hands that soothed fever would return to the river by morning, dipping the same bucket again. Clean water was a dream too distant to imagine. The healers spoke of bad humors, invisible vapors that rose from the river and poisoned the air. Their cures were as futile as their understanding. They offered charms, whispered prayers, and burned herbs beside the sick. None of it mattered. The infection did not need breath to spread. It traveled in every gulp, every drop swallowed in faith or ignorance. People lived in a constant cycle of thirst and sickness, each generation passing the same diseases to the next. I can almost picture a woman kneeling at the water's edge, her skirt soaked with mud, her reflection rippling beside a dead crow caught in the weeds. She dips her jug slowly, watching the surface break, the color of the water turning from brown to darker brown as it fills. She sighs, knowing it will sicken her family, yet she lifts it anyway. It is haunting how easily necessity silences reason when the choice is thirst or poison. The river was not cruel. It simply gave what was asked of it. In that world, purity did not exist. Everything was touched by death in some form. The same water that baptized infants buried them weeks later. The same hands that washed the dead prepared the evening meal. People did not separate the sacred from the filthy because life itself allowed no such division. They lived in a world where survival required blindness, and blindness was often the only mercy. The rivers never rested. They flowed through centuries, carrying history, memory, and disease. The people who depended on them did not curse them, because to curse the river was to curse life itself. They simply drank, prayed, and hoped the next swallow would not be their last. The rivers of England once mirrored the people who drank from them, strong, resilient, and filled with decay beneath the surface. As they glimmered under the gray sky, they carried both life and death in equal measure. And somewhere along those banks, a new kind of sickness was already waiting. One that would crawl not through the water, but through the hair on every head. Lice were the constant companions of life in the Dark Ages. As ordinary as hunger and as stubborn as cold, they lived in every household, crawling beneath collars, behind ears, inside blankets, and across children's scalps. No one was spared. Not the peasants who slept on straw, not the monks who prayed in silence, not even the lords who dressed in wool and fur. The itching was endless, turning sleep into torment and comfort into memory. Scratching became as common as breathing. It is almost laughable that a whole village could share both bread and parasites in perfect equality. The infestation began quietly, a tickle at the nape of the neck, then a burning that no amount of washing could soothe. The more people scratched, the more their skin bled, and the lice thrived on the warmth of those wounds. Combs made from bone or wood broke easily, and even when they worked, there was nowhere clean to keep them. The eggs clung to hair like dust to oil, impossible to remove entirely. The only cure that truly worked was the cruelest one, to shave everything away. Cloisters and homes alike were filled with the sound of blades scraping against scalp. Men, women, and even small children sat in lines as hair fell like dry straw to the floor. The air smelled faintly of sweat and iron. Heads were rubbed with ashes, vinegar, or urine, anything that might drive the lice away. When it was done, they covered themselves with woolen caps to hide their baldness and protect against the cold. The hats itched too, but differently, and people accepted that as an improvement. If one compares it to the present, it would be like burning your wardrobe to kill a single moth. Hair became a symbol of both shame and necessity. Long hair meant dirt and infestation, while baldness meant survival. The few who kept their locks were judged as vain or foolish, accused of inviting disease. In monasteries, the tonsure, a circle shaved into the crown of the head, was not only a sign of devotion, but also a practical defense. The priests called it holy, but perhaps it was simply hygienic desperation wrapped in faith. For peasants, the look was less sacred and more pitiful, a mark of poverty displayed on every head. The lice did not stay confined to the body. They infested clothing seams, straw mattresses, and animal furs. People woke to find their necks bleeding and their sheets moving. They boiled their garments when firewood allowed, though boiling often ruined the cloth. Those who could not afford to waste fuel hung their clothes in the smoke of fires, hoping the fumes would suffocate the pests. The smell of smoke and sweat filled every room, clinging to skin as tightly as the lice themselves. Women tried to disguise the shaving by weaving scarves or knitting caps in bright colors, turning necessity into a small act of dignity. But the truth was visible. A village of shaved heads looked like a place of punishment. The difference between plague and pride was only a matter of fabric. Children laughed at each other's smooth scalps, then scratched at their own. The cycle never ended. There was a certain hopeless rhythm to it. All shave, cover, itch, repeat. No matter how many times they purged, the lice returned. They came with travelers, spread through bedding, hid in seams, and thrived in the constant filth that no one had the means to escape. Cleanliness was a dream. Purity, a word reserved for saints. The living learned to coexist with discomfort, their bodies never fully their own. I can imagine the scene on a gray morning. A woman kneeling beside her daughter, scissors in hand, eyes tired but determined. The child's hair falls away in clumps, revealing small red bites beneath. The woman hums softly, not to comfort the child, but to drown out the sound of snipping. When it is done, she kisses the girl's bare head and ties a wool cap over it. Both of them know the lice will return. It is haunting how easily people can turn humiliation into routine when survival demands it. In time, bald heads became so common that no one saw them as strange. A shaven scalp meant caution, wisdom, and practicality. It meant you were still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the invisible armies that ruled your skin. And yet, beneath the caps, the scalp remained raw, the skin tender, always waiting for the next invasion. The war against the lice was unwinnable, fought in silence, and endured without complaint. The rich fared little better. Their furs, soft and costly, became nests for parasites. Their perfumes only masked the odor, never removing the cause. Even queens were rumored to keep servants who combed their heads for hours, crushing lice between fingernails and wiping them on linen. No crown could protect against the itch. In a world where death waited behind every illness, life was strangely democratic. They did not care for titles, wealth, or prayer. They simply thrived wherever warmth and flesh were found. To be alive was to be food, and no one escaped that truth for long. The villagers learned to live with the scratching and the shame, heads hidden under knitted caps, dignity preserved through silence. The air buzzed, not with insects, but with resignation, and just when they thought they had seen the worst of filth, their very food began to turn against them. Bread was supposed to be life, yet in the Dark Ages, it often carried death. Every loaf was a gamble, every meal an act of blind faith.
The grain that fed entire villages also hid their undoing, blackened and rotting long before it reached the oven. Mold clung to each kernel like soot, spreading quietly through sacks stacked in damp storage. Rats gnawed at the grain, leaving droppings that blended with the flour. Still, people ground it, kneaded it, and baked it because hunger was louder than fear. It is morbidly funny that bread, the symbol of survival, became the most common cause of death. The air inside those huts was thick with a smell of yeast and decay. Women pounded the dough with rough hands, ignoring the gray streaks that marbled the flour. The ovens glowed weakly, their smoke curling through holes in the thatched roofs. When the bread was ready, it looked wholesome, brown, solid, warm, yet within its crust lay poison born from rot and neglect. Children tore into it eagerly, their mouths dusted with ash, their teeth grinding against bits of stone or rat bone. The taste was sour but familiar, and no one questioned it. The poison came from ergo, a fungus that thrived in damp rye. It spread invisible threads through the grain, weaving death into each loaf. The symptoms appeared soon after eating. Hands trembled, vision blurred, and limbs twisted with cramps. Some saw shapes that were not there, demons crawling along the walls, angels descending from the smoke. Others screamed as their fingers blackened and fell away. The taste was sour, but familiar, and no one questioned it. The poison came from ergo, a fungus that thrived in damp rye. It spread invisible threads through the grain, weaving death into each loaf. The symptoms appeared soon after eating. Hands trembled, vision blurred, and limbs twisted with cramps. Some saw shapes that were not there, demons crawling along the walls, angels descending from the smoke. Others screamed as their fingers blackened and fell away. It was called Saint Anthony's fire, as if holiness could explain horror. People believed it was punishment from God, never realizing it was the meal itself that condemned them. Villages struck by the fungus fell into madness. The sick convulsed in the streets, their eyes rolling white, their screams echoing through the night. Mothers clutched their children as if to hold them inside their bodies again where no poison could reach. Priests walked among them, swinging censers, blessing the dying, and accusing the living of sin. To those who survived, the world looked unreal. The fever left them thin, their minds fractured. Some wandered away into forests, chasing visions that never ended. If one compares it to modern times, it would be like eating bread that sends you into hallucinations while everyone around you insists you are possessed. The famine years made it worse. When harvest failed, people scraped the last grains from cellars, mixing them with sawdust or clay to stretch the supply. The more desperate they became, the more deadly their bread grew. The poor baked what the rats refused to eat, shaping loaves that cracked like old bone. The smell was unbearable, but the thought of starvation was worse. They ate quickly, praying through every bite, hoping this meal would be the one to keep them alive. Many died before morning, their bodies found beside half-eaten crusts. There were no warnings, no patterns to follow. One loaf killed, another nourished. Survival depended on luck, not judgment. The same family that ate safely one day might wake to screams the next. People began to fear food itself, yet hunger was relentless. It did not matter that bread could burn through flesh like fire. People kept baking, kept eating. The mind learns to ignore what it cannot change. The rich suffered too, though differently. Their grain came from larger stores mixed with spoiled batches from distant farms. They ate in candlelit halls, never knowing their luxury feasts carried the same poison that haunted the poor. Servants who handled the dough first showed signs: trembling, sickness, collapse. The masters called it laziness, then watched their own hands turn purple. But wealth could not buy clean air or dry barns. The fungus did not discriminate. In some places, outbreaks were so severe that entire villages were abandoned. The survivors believed demons had taken residence there. Fires were set to the fields, and ashes blew across the landscape like gray snow. For a few years, people avoided rye entirely, turning to barley or oats. But famine always returned, and with it, the deadly grain. Generations repeated the same mistake, baking and dying by the same bread. I can almost picture one of those huts at twilight, a loaf cooling on the wooden table, its crust cracked and steaming. A woman tears it open, feeding pieces to her children, her eyes tired but soft. She does not notice the faint purple hue beneath the crust, the way the smell bites at her throat. They eat in silence, grateful for warmth, unaware that poison sits where prayer should be. It is chilling how trust can be placed so fully in something that kills so slowly. In that world, ignorance was not failure, it was mercy. The body's reaction to ergo was unpredictable. Some died quickly, others lingered, their limbs stiffening, their skin mottled with burns that came from within. When death came, it was often mistaken for holiness. Those who hallucinated spoke of visions of heaven, of saints calling their names. The church recorded miracles while entire families rotted in their beds.
The earth swallowed their bodies, and the fields that killed them grew green again. By the next harvest, the same grain returned, and the same cycle began anew. Bread was sacred, and no one dared to stop eating it. Hunger forgave all sins, even the sin of eating death. The bread that should have fed them became the hand that starved them. Soft to touch, cruel in truth. Its scent filled homes with false comfort, while its poison hollowed them from within. And as their faith in food crumbled, the faith in time itself began to fade. For even the passing of days had no meaning in a world that no longer counted them. Time in the Dark Ages was not measured, it was felt. Days stretched and folded into one another, indistinguishable beneath the same gray sky. There were no clocks to divide them, no calendars to hold them still. People rose when light entered their huts and slept when darkness returned. The rhythm of existence belonged not to man, but to nature, to the sun, the seasons, and the toll of church bells that reminded everyone when to pray, when to work, and when to stop. It is strangely haunting that people lived entire lives without ever knowing when they began or ended. There were no birthdays, no anniversaries, no numbered years to remember. Time was a whisper, not a fact. A man might say he had seen 20 winters or 50 harvests, but it was only a guess. The church kept records for kings and saints, not for the poor, for most. Life passed without a single written trace. The newborn came nameless into the mud, and the dead left it just the same. The seasons were the only calendar, and the weather the only clock. Morning and evening were known by light, not by hour.
Dawn's pale glow was the call to labor, and sunset was the signal to stop. Between them, life unfolded in repetition, milking, sewing, grinding, mending. Bells from distant chapels marked prayer hours, though few understood the Latin words tied to them. The sound simply divided the day into fragments of obedience. When the bells fell silent, people relied on shadows, the angle of sunlight against the doorway, or the depth of their hunger to tell how long they had worked. The passing of years meant little because every year looked the same. Children grew taller, faces wrinkled, but no one knew by how much time. Old age was not counted, but observed in the stoop of the back, the trembling of hands. Men married when they could work, women when they could bleed. Childhood ended when the body demanded it, not when the calendar decreed it. Death came whenever it pleased, and no one called it early or late. If one compares it to today, it would be like living your entire life inside a fog where clocks do not tick and every dawn feels like yesterday's shadow. Festivals offered the only illusion of time: Easter, harvest, solstice. Each one repeated endlessly, blurring together like echoes in a long hallway. People marked memory through these cycles: the winter of the bad crop, the summer of the fever, the year the river froze. Stories replaced numbers, and memory replaced history. Even the priests who spoke of centuries did so vaguely, their dates drawn from scripture more than from record. For the common people, the world had always been as it was, and always would be. The church's bells became the heartbeat of time itself. They rang not just for prayer, but for order, announcing births, deaths, marriages, storms.
To hear them was to know you existed within something greater.
even if that something had no clear boundaries. Without them, silence felt endless. Villages without bells were said to exist outside God's time, places where eternity began and ended without sound. The living feared such silence, for it felt like being forgotten. In the absence of measurement, patience and resignation grew naturally. Waiting did not exist because there was nothing to wait for. People worked until they were tired, rested until hunger woke them, and aged until they could not move. The urgency that drives modern life was unknown. Each action flowed into the next, and the present moment stretched without edges. Days were not lost, they simply never arrived. I can almost see a man standing in a field, his face lit by pale light, wondering if it is morning or evening. The air smells of frost. The sky is heavy with clouds, and somewhere a bell tolls faintly in the distance. He does not count how long he has stood there, because counting means nothing. He knows only that it is time to move, or perhaps time to stop. It is unsettling how peace and ignorance can look the same when the world offers no way to tell them apart. In that stillness, existence feels eternal yet empty, as if time itself were too tired to move forward. The concept of youth and age blurred completely. A man might call his wife young, though she was already a grandmother. A child might seem grown by 12, carrying burdens that had no age. The faces of the people reflected not years, but struggle. The idea of a lifetime was abstract. Life was simply a task repeated until it ended. There were no historians among the poor, no diaries, no recorded hours. Time belonged to the heavens, not to humans. When comets appeared or eclipses darkened the sun, people trembled, believing the world had skipped a beat in its endless rhythm. Then when light returned, so did normality, and the days continued as if nothing had happened. Without calendars, there was also no future, only endurance. Plans stretched no farther than the next season, the next harvest, the next meal. Hope was as short-lived as daylight in winter. Time, unmeasured and endless, did not comfort. It consumed quietly without marking its passage. The people of the Dark Ages lived outside the ticking of the world, their days dissolving into each other like mist on cold mornings. For them, eternity was not in heaven. It was the endless sameness of life itself. And as they worked beneath gray skies, a new fear began to take shape. The fear of breaking the rules of those who claimed to own everything, even the rivers and the fish within them. In the Dark Ages, even hunger was a crime. The rivers that wound through the countryside, the lakes that mirrored the gray sky, the forests that whispered in the wind. None of them belonged to those who lived beside them. They belonged to the lords, to the men who claimed divine right over every creature that moved and every drop that flowed. A peasant might stare at a stream full of fish, his belly twisting with hunger, and still dare not cast a line. The water was forbidden, its life reserved for another man's table. It is darkly absurd that a person could die for touching the food God placed within reach. Every inch of land was owned by someone with a title, and every breath of air felt borrowed. Even birds that flew overhead could be claimed by law. The common folk knew their place, low, obedient, and always watched. The punishment for stealing a fish was not a fine, but mutilation or death. Men were caught with wet hands and came home with none. Some were hanged beside the very ponds they had tried to fish from, their bodies swaying as warnings to others. The lords called it justice, the peasants called it fate. The desperation that led to such crimes was simple. Hunger could not read laws. When crops failed, people turned to streams and woods for mercy. They set traps at night, moving silently through reeds, praying the moonlight would not betray them. Some carried their children on their backs, hoping to feed them even one meal. But the forests had ears, and the rivers had spies. The lord's men patrolled on horseback, their dogs trained to sniff out both game and guilt. When they found intruders, the punishment was swift. A blow to the head, a rope around the neck, or worse, a return to the village with one hand missing. Justice in those days was not about guilt, but about ownership. The Lord's word outweighed truth,
and his anger was the only evidence needed. A peasant caught near water could not plead innocence, for simply standing there was enough to condemn him. Trials were short, confessions beaten out with sticks. The church blessed the punishment, declaring that God had given hierarchy for a reason. Mercy was reserved for those who could afford it. If one compares it to today, it would be like starving beside a supermarket where everything is forbidden to you by law. Families learned to accept hunger as their inheritance. Mothers told their children to look away from the water, to ignore the glimmer of fish beneath the surface. Better to suffer quietly than to die publicly. Yet sometimes desperation broke obedience.
There were stories whispered of men who fished under the cover of fog, who returned with enough food to keep their families alive. But most of these stories ended with disappearances. No one asked where they went. Everyone already knew. The lords, sitting in their halls, feasted on roasted meats and fresh trout from the same streams that peasants feared to touch. Their banquets were decorated with abundance, the air filled with laughter and candlelight. Outside those walls, the same laughter echoed in hunger's hollow mockery. The divide between those who owned and those who begged was as wide as the river itself. The peasants believed God had chosen this order, and the priests agreed, for they dined with the lords. Rebellion flickered only in thoughts. The poor were too tired to fight and too faithful to doubt. They worked the land that was not theirs, paid taxes for soil they could not claim, and prayed to a God they could never reach without permission. The rivers glimmered like temptation, both beautiful and cruel. To fish was to sin, not against heaven, but against hierarchy. The world itself had been divided, and even the smallest act of defiance, casting a net, became an act of war. I can almost picture a man kneeling by a silent stream at dusk, his reflection trembling beside the ripples. He listens for dogs, for hooves, for the sound of authority in the distance. His fingers shake as he lowers the line, not from cold, but from fear. Behind him, the trees lean in like witnesses. He catches one fish, its scales shining faintly in the fading light, a moment of victory before the inevitable punishment. It is haunting how survival can be mistaken for rebellion when the world belongs to someone else. When dawn comes, the village finds him hanging near the water, the fish still beside his feet. No one dares remove it. They walk past quickly, eyes lowered, their own hunger knotting tighter. The lesson is clear. Life is not yours to take, even when it is dying in front of you. The rivers continue to flow, indifferent. The fish move freely beneath the surface, untouched by laws, feeding on the decay of those who once tried to claim them. The cycle repeats: hunger, theft, punishment, until it becomes a rhythm as natural as breathing. The lords ruled the land, the rivers, and even the air, while the peasants ruled only their silence. Each act of defiance ended in death. Each death fed the soil that others still tilled. And while some fought for food, others fought for names, because in that same world, many lived and died without ever truly having one. Identity in the Dark Ages was as fragile as breath. Most people lived and died without a true name, known only by their labor, their master, or the place they inhabited. A man might be called John the Smith, William of the Hill, or simply the miller's son. His existence defined entirely by what he did rather than who he was. When he died, the name went with him, replaced by another John, another son, another laborer. Names were not possessions, but descriptions, as temporary as the roofs that covered their homes. It is almost tragic that a lifetime of work could vanish into dust because no one thought to write it down. There were no birth records, no written proof that a person had ever existed. The poor were born in silence and died in it. Their only witnesses were the few who stood nearby, who themselves would one day vanish without a trace.
The church recorded baptisms for its own sake, but the details were vague. A first name, a season, a priest's signature in Latin. Last names were unnecessary, for most never traveled beyond their village. You were who others said you were, and once they forgot, you were gone. To be nameless was not seen as a loss, it was simply normal. People knew one another by the curve of a face, the sound of a voice, the smell of the work they did. The blacksmith carried iron in his scent. The shepherd carried wool. The farmer carried earth. These were the marks of identity. When strangers arrived, they were described by what they carried or wore, not by what they were called. A man without work was invisible. A man without witnesses, non-existent. The idea of a family name belonged only to those who owned land. The lords and priests had records, crests, and titles that survived generations. The peasants had memory, and memory was easily erased. If a family line failed to produce heirs, it vanished from the world like smoke. The soil remembered their hands better than history remembered their faces. If one compares it to today, it would be like living an entire life without a name, a home, or a document proving you ever breathed. Children were often named after saints or relatives who had died. The same few names repeating endlessly through centuries. In a single village, there might be 10 Johns, 5 Marys, and 3 Thomases, all answering to shouts rather than individuality. Confusion was constant but unimportant. People did not aspire to stand apart. They aspired to survive. The notion of uniqueness was foreign. To be different was dangerous. To be anonymous was safe. When someone disappeared, taken by hunger, war, or disease, no records were filed, no searches begun. Their huts were simply emptied, their tools reused, their memory fading like smoke from a dying fire. The village adjusted quickly. Life continued as though the missing had never lived at all. Only their footprints remained for a time, washed away by rain or covered by another's. In that world, death was not an event but an erasure. The few who traveled beyond their birthplaces faced even greater uncertainty. Without papers, they had no way to prove who they were or where they came from. Each new town required reinvention. A man might introduce himself with a trade he barely knew, a woman with a name she invented on the spot. Lies and truths blended easily because no one could tell them apart. Identity was fluid, reshaped by necessity and fear. I can picture one of them, a man sitting by a dying fire, his clothes torn, his face hardened by wind and work. When asked his name, he hesitates before answering, unsure which version of himself to reveal. His voice cracks from disuse, and the name that leaves his lips feels borrowed. No one questions it tomorrow. He may call himself something else. It is unsettling how freedom and disappearance can look so alike when nothing ties you to existence. The church occasionally tried to keep order through naming. Priests assigned surnames based on trade, place, or even insult. A stubborn man might become John Stronghead, a poor one John Dust, a small one John Little. These names stuck, spreading through generations until they hardened into lineage. Yet even then, they carried no protection. A name might survive, but the person behind it would still die forgotten. Without identity, justice became impossible. A lord could kill a peasant without a record, and no one would know which John had died. No complaint could be filed, no family traced. The dead left no proof, and therefore no consequence. The system thrived on that silence. The nameless were easy to replace. Life without records meant death without memory. Graves were marked by stones or wooden crosses, uncarved and soon decayed. The earth swallowed the evidence of lives lived in quiet obedience. Villages rose, burned, and rebuilt over the bones of those who had no names left to remember. The land itself became their only tombstone. Still, among the nameless, there was a strange peace. Without names, there was no pride to wound, no legacy to lose. Existence was brief, but it was free from pretense. The people lived not for history, but for the next meal, the next sunrise, the next dry night. Their lives were small, but certain in their simplicity. The peasants of England's Dark Ages moved through life like shadows without labels, known by touch and scent more than by word. Their stories ended as quietly as they began, their names lost to the wind, and among those who remained, even the children learned early that working and dying was certain, but growing old was not. Childhood in the Dark Ages was over before it began. The moment a child could stand, they were handed a task to carry water, to feed animals, to sweep, to serve. Laughter and play were luxuries for the rich. For everyone else, existence was work measured in aching limbs and raw hands. No one asked how old a child was, only whether they were strong enough to be useful. The sight of tiny figures trudging through mud behind herds of sheep or bent over fields was not tragic to their parents. It was survival. It is cruelly ironic that the smallest shoulders carried the weight of the entire household.
There were no toys, no books, no lessons beyond obedience. The world itself was the classroom, and the lessons were harsh. A child learned to fear hunger before understanding what it meant to be full. They learned to fear the cold before learning the comfort of fire. Their hands blistered before they could write their names. By the time their teeth fell out, they were already part of the laboring world. The idea of innocence did not exist, only usefulness did. Children rose before the sun, their breath forming pale clouds in the frozen air. They carried baskets, fetched firewood, or followed their parents into the fields where frost cut into their skin. The smallest ones were tied to goats or fence posts to keep them from wandering, crying quietly while their parents worked. At night, families slept side by side on straw, lice crawling over their scalps, exhaustion heavier than dreams. No one told bedtime stories. No one had the strength. Sleep came like surrender, and morning returned like punishment. The church preached that work was holy, even for children. Priests blessed the fields and praised labor as a form of prayer. A child's pain was said to please God, proof of their family's devotion. When one died from hunger, from cold, from being struck by an impatient hand, their death was folded into faith. The priest would say the child had gone to heaven, though their small body lay in a shallow grave dug behind the house. If one compares it to the modern world, it would be like calling exhaustion education and bruises a diploma. There were no schools, no hours of play, no alphabet to learn. Knowledge was inherited through repetition. A daughter learned to spin by watching her mother's hands. A son learned to plow by following his father's steps. Mistakes were corrected with blows, not words. Curiosity was a dangerous trait. Questions wasted time, and time meant food. The church offered scripture, but only to those who could afford the luxury of not working. For the rest, the only holy words they knew were the prayers they whispered in the dark. Some children were sent to serve in noble houses, exchanging family for servitude. They polished boots, tended fires, and slept on cold floors, their names forgotten by those they served. Others worked in barns and mills, their bodies bent and bones malformed before they reached adulthood. The unlucky ones were sold entirely as apprentices, servants or laborers in distant lands. Families called it an opportunity, though everyone knew it was just another kind of loss. The winters were the hardest. Small bodies froze quickly, and even a day without food could be fatal. Villages often buried children in groups wrapped in rags, their graves marked only by stones. Mothers learned not to cry too loudly. Grief wasted strength. Life demanded endurance, not mourning. The children who survived grew into adults who did not remember being young. Their memories were of work, hunger, and the relief of still breathing. I can almost see one of them, a boy no older than 6, dragging a bucket of water through the mud. His legs tremble under the weight, his hands red from the cold. He glances toward the horizon, where smoke from his home rises faintly, and for a moment he pauses. A bird lands nearby, bright and free, but he does not look long. There is more water to fetch, and no one waiting to tell him otherwise. It is haunting how quickly necessity can erase innocence, turning children into tools before they even understand their own names. Their laughter, when it existed, was small and fleeting, a giggle between chores, a whisper behind a barn, but even joy had to hide. A shout, a broken plate, a clumsy mistake could bring punishment. Childhood was not a stage of life, but a brief condition, easily lost and rarely mourned. The world gave nothing freely, not even time to grow. To live was to labor, and to labor was to live. The rhythm of the fields became the rhythm of the heart, planting, harvesting, enduring. Childhood blended into adulthood like dusk into night, without ceremony or pause.
The children of the Dark Ages learned to work before they learned to speak of dreams. Their small hands built the world they would never own. Their backs bent before their names were remembered. And when age finally freed them from labor, their bodies failed first, leaving them old before their years. Old age in the Dark Ages was not a reward for surviving. It was a slow dismissal from life. The moment a body could no longer lift, bend, or carry, it ceased to be useful, and usefulness was the only value the world respected. There were no pensions, no comfort, no dignity waiting at the end of labor. The elderly were reminders of what everyone feared: weakness, dependence, decay. When their strength ran out, they were quietly set aside, left to fade away in silence. It is bitterly ironic that a lifetime of endurance ended not in rest but in abandonment. Families did not intend cruelty, they simply had no means to care. Each mouth needed feeding, and winter spared no one. A weak father could not plow, a frail mother could not spin, and food was too scarce to share with those who could no longer earn it. Sometimes the old were moved into a smaller hut at the edge of the village, a gesture that looked like mercy but felt like exile. They received a few scraps, a blanket, perhaps a promise to visit, and then the visit stopped. The young worked, the seasons turned, and the forgotten grew older in solitude. Inside those huts, the air was damp, thick with the smell of cold ashes. The firewood ran out first, then the food. The old wrapped themselves in rags, their joints stiff from frost, their minds wandering back to days when they still had purpose. Some spoke to the walls, others to the wind. When hunger sharpened, they ate whatever they could, roots, bark, even straw. Yet few begged, pride outlived strength, and silence was the only dignity left. If one compares it to today, it would be like locking the elderly in an empty house and calling it peace. The villagers did not speak openly about it. Everyone knew it happened. Everyone pretended it did not. To acknowledge it was to admit their own future. Children learned early not to grow too attached to their grandparents, for affection was a luxury that time would punish. The church said suffering purified the soul, and so they accepted neglect as piety. Death by cold or hunger was framed as God's gentle calling, though it felt more like the world turning its back. The winters were merciless. Huts collapsed under snow, and inside, bodies stiffened quietly. The villagers found them weeks later, frozen into stillness, faces peaceful only because there was nothing left to feel. Sometimes, if the ground was too hard for burial, the bodies were left until spring. By then, no one remembered their names. The dead were simply another part of the landscape, their absence easier to live with than their presence had been. Aging itself was considered a burden. The wrinkled face, the trembling hand, the slow gait, all signs of decline that no one celebrated. Those who lived long enough to see grandchildren were rare, and even rarer were those who died surrounded by them. The body's decay mirrored the decay of memory. Once the elderly stopped working, they became ghosts in their own homes, watching from corners as life continued without them. The few who clung to survival did so through stubbornness. Some gathered herbs to trade, others tended goats too small to butcher. They worked until their bones broke, as if labor could delay death. When they fell ill, there were no healers, no medicines. The sick were left to cough in the dark, whispering prayers that rose into roofs blackened by smoke. Occasionally, a kind soul brought water or bread, but kindness was fleeting. It could not compete with necessity. I can picture one of them, an old man sitting by a dying fire, his hands trembling as he tries to warm them. His eyes stare into the embers, searching for shapes that no longer exist. Outside, snow drifts against the door, sealing him in. He listens to the wind, which sounds almost like the voices of his family, but no one comes. It is haunting how silence can become both punishment and companion at the end of a hard life. He closes his eyes, not from peace, but from exhaustion. When the villagers pass his hut in spring, they speak of him softly, as if death were contagious. They bury him shallow, cover him with stones, and move on. No one marks the place. By the next winter, the earth forgets him completely.
The cycle continues: youth, labor, weakness, disappearance. To live long enough to die old was both a miracle and a curse. The strong feared the old because they saw themselves reflected there. Every backache, every gray hair was a warning. So they worked harder, spoke louder, as if movement itself could keep time from noticing them. But time noticed everyone eventually. The old did not rage because rage requires hope. They accepted their place as the world's discarded. Their reward for survival was the chance to die slowly, quietly, unseen. The forgotten elders of the Dark Ages left the world as they had entered it, uncounted, unnamed, and alone. Their deaths made room for the living, who worked under the same sky, bound for the same fate. And somewhere between prayers and frost, a new terror waited. The fear of women whose difference condemned them to fire. In the Dark Ages, being different could cost your life. A woman who spoke her mind, lived alone, or healed with herbs was a danger by existing alone. The age feared what it could not explain, and superstition filled the void where knowledge should have been. A birthmark became a curse, a widow became a threat, and a healer became a servant of evil. The church said the devil worked through the weak, and no one doubted the church. Fear turned ordinary women into targets, and once the word witch escaped a mouth, it could not be taken back. It is almost laughable that centuries of faith and ritual could crumble before a rumor whispered beside a dying fire. Accusations rarely needed a reason. A cow dying, a child falling ill, a storm ruining crops. Anything could be blamed on the woman next door. If she had ever been kind, that kindness was called a lure. If she had ever been angry, that anger became proof. There was no logic, only fear disguised as righteousness. The poor, the widowed, and the childless suffered most, for they had no one to defend them. People wanted to believe that evil could be burned out of their world, and that belief demanded victims. The church fueled it, whether intentionally or through neglect. Priests preached of demons in human form, warning that sin and temptation had faces. Every illness, every misfortune, every strange dream became the devil's shadow. Those who doubted were told that disbelief was itself a sin, and so even the skeptical stayed silent. A trial was not a search for truth, it was a play written in advance. The woman accused would be found guilty whether she spoke or stayed silent, prayed or cursed. She could confess, deny, or scream. The ending never changed. The punishment was public. It had to be so that others could watch and learn obedience. The accused was dragged through the village, tied to a pole, and surrounded by her neighbors. Sometimes she was drowned first, sometimes beaten, sometimes starved. If she lived through it, her survival was declared proof that she had been protected by the devil. If she died, her innocence was praised after the fire had gone cold. If one compares it to the modern world, it would be like punishing a person for standing out, for refusing to be ordinary, and calling that justice. Many of the women called witches were healers. They gathered herbs, made salves, and helped bring children into the world. When sickness came, people begged for their help. When death came, people blamed them for failing. Their knowledge was both needed and feared. The boundary between healing and witchcraft was invisible, drawn and erased by hunger, jealousy, or grief. In villages where death was common, someone always had to take the blame. And it was easier to accuse a woman with a scar in a garden than to accept that life itself was cruel. I can see her in my mind, a woman in her middle years, strong from labor, hands rough from grinding herbs. She lives alone in a hut on the edge of the forest. One morning, soldiers arrive. They drag her out, her hair tangled, her dress torn, her eyes hollow with disbelief. The priest holds a cross before her face, shouting prayers that sound more like curses. She does not resist. The villagers watch from behind fences, pretending not to know her. Her neighbors, her friends, even the children she once helped to heal, all keep their heads down.
When the fire starts, she looks upward, not pleading for mercy, but simply searching for air. It is terrifying how calm looks like guilt looks when everyone around you needs a monster to burn. The flames did more than kill. They cleansed fear by feeding it. People went home afterward feeling safe, though nothing had changed. Crops still failed, diseases still came, and death still walked among them. The only difference was that one less woman lived to remind them of their ignorance. Some burned hundreds, others only a few. But the fire never truly stopped. The same pattern repeated for centuries: suspicion, accusation, confession, execution. And the more women burned, the easier it became to light the next pyre. The villagers who survived learned lessons written in smoke. Speak softly, obey the priest, hide your knowledge, and never stand alone. Daughters grew up watching their mothers whisper instead of laugh, nod instead of argue. Generations of silence grew out of that fear, even when the word witch lost its literal flames. Its echo remained in how women behaved, shrinking themselves to fit into safety.
The Dark Ages burned bodies, but what lingered was obedience. Some women fought back in quiet ways. They kept their herbs, they whispered cures. They passed recipes for healing hidden inside prayers. Their rebellion was survival. Yet even that defiance carried risk, because every kindness was a gamble. Saving a sick child could earn gratitude or accusation, depending on whether the child lived or died. In such a world, good deeds were as dangerous as sins. The church called it cleansing, but it was control. Burning witches was not about faith. It was about reminding people where power belonged. A woman who healed without permission was a threat. A woman who spoke without restraint was a danger. A woman who lived without a man was an insult to the order of things. The pyre was not a punishment for crime. It was a warning to all others who might forget their place. I sometimes imagine the quiet after such a burning, the faint hiss of cooling ash, the murmurs fading into wind. The villagers would walk home past the blackened stake, their faces pale, their mouths tight. The children would ask questions, and their parents would silence them with a glare. Fear settled again. Not loud, not bright, but heavy and constant, like a low fog that never lifted. Even centuries later, its residue still clung to the way people judge difference. The world forgot the women's names, but remembered their warning. In time, the fires burned out, but the need to accuse found new forms. Words replaced flames, but the purpose stayed the same: to isolate those who refuse to conform. The witch trials were history, yet the instinct to destroy what frightens us endured. In every century that followed, some group wore the same label: outsider, heretic, threat. The torch just changed hands. The tragedy of those women was not only their deaths, but the silence left behind. Their absence hollowed the villages, stripped them of wisdom, and left ignorance to reign unchallenged. Without them, knowledge became a relic, and fear became law. The women of the Dark Ages did not vanish, they were erased. Their screams turned into smoke, their knowledge into superstition, their independence into legend. Those who watched believed they had purified the world. Yet what they truly burned was their own humanity. And as belief hardened into obsession, that same faith would grow into something darker, a collective nightmare disguised as devotion. The Dark Ages did not remember you. It remembered kings, conquerors, priests, and saints, but not the hands that built their kingdoms or the hearts that broke beneath their wars. You could live a lifetime plowing, birthing, bleeding, praying, and the world would still forget you. There were no tombstones, no names carved in stone, no written record that you ever breathed. Death came quietly, the same way life had begun, without ceremony or witness. It is grimly amusing that an age so obsessed with eternity left almost no trace of the people who filled it. The nameless filled the fields and roads, the villages and the wars, and when they died, they vanished like smoke. The priest might say a prayer, if there was time, or if someone had something to offer the church.
Otherwise, you were buried in the same dirt you once worked, your grave marked with a branch or a pile of stones. The wind took those away eventually, and the earth swallowed the rest. The only permanence was forgetting. For the rich, death had a name. For everyone else, it was just a fact.
There were no birth records, no family trees, no songs. A child could grow, live, and die without a single line written about them. The church kept records of baptisms and marriages, but only when the family could pay. Most could not. The result was a world where only the powerful were remembered, and everyone else simply disappeared. There is no priest, no candle, only the sound of her breathing and the cold earth closing. Tomorrow she will return to the field as if nothing happened. She cannot afford to mourn for long. Her grief is silent, her love undocumented. When she dies, the same will be done for her. If one compares it to today, it would be like deleting an entire life from every archive, every photograph, every trace of memory, as if a person never existed at all. History has no room for those who merely endured. It speaks of victories, not hunger, of rulers, not the ruled. Every monument is a confession of bias, every chronicle a curated lie. The poor built kingdoms but never entered their own stories. Their lives existed between wars and winters unnoticed by the pens of scribes. The few who learned to write were monks, and monks did not record the struggles of peasants. They recorded miracles, not blisters. Still, even forgotten lives had weight. The nameless kept the world moving. They grew the grain that fed armies, forged the tools that built cathedrals, raised the children who would die in battles no one remembered. Their reward was oblivion. No one thought this was unjust. It was simply how the world worked. The idea that every life should matter was still centuries away.
Sometimes after a storm, bones would rise from the soil where graves had eroded. The villagers would collect them and bury them again without knowing whose they were. The bones of strangers mixed with the bones of family. Memory dissolved into the ground. The land itself became a graveyard of unmarked stories. The silence of the forgotten was immense. There were no songs for them, no prayers carved in glass. But the weight of their existence lingered, unseen yet undeniable, shaping the world for those who would inherit it. They left behind the fields they plowed, the tools they shaped, the walls they built, and the children who never knew their names. That was their legacy, invisible but essential. To live, then, was not to be remembered, but simply to survive another day. The purpose of life was continuation, not recognition. The rhythm of existence was circular: birth, toil, hunger, sleep, death. The miracle was not being noticed. It was still breathing when the sun rose. It strikes me that in a world without memory, even the smallest act of kindness might have been the only immortality available. The storytellers came much later, long after the dead had turned to dust. They wrote of heroes and kings, of saints and sinners, but never of the people who lit their fires or washed their clothes. By then, the truth had already faded. The Dark Ages became legend, and legends do not remember peasants. If you lived through it, your reward was silence. Your children might forget your face, your village might forget your name, and history certainly would. Yet strangely, there was peace in that. You did not live for glory. You lived because life was the only thing left to do. You rose each day, carried water, worked the soil, and watched the seasons pass. That was your story. Unwritten, unspoken, unending. The absence of memory did not mean the absence of worth. Every unseen gesture, every unrecorded kindness, every unnoticed breath was part of a greater human persistence. Though history did not write your name, you kept the world alive long enough for someone else to remember it. In that way, the forgotten were the foundation of everything that came after. They were the reason villagers survived, why faith endured, why humanity continued despite the hunger, the disease, and the darkness. Without their quiet endurance, there would have been no kings to remember, no churches to record, no future to inherit. Their invisibility was not failure, it was sacrifice. When I think of the Dark Ages, I no longer see only the kings or the wars. I see the hands that built without hope of credit, the mothers who died unnamed, the children who vanished before memory could hold them. Their silence fills the centuries more deeply than any anthem or chronicle. Maybe the greatest tragedy of their lives is also their triumph, that they kept living even when no one cared, that they built a world that would forget them yet still carried it forward. Their memory lives not in words, but in the air, in the soil, in the quiet rhythm of survival that never stopped. So when the wind passes over old ruins or through the grass of an unmarked field, it might still carry their breath. They are not gone, they are simply unrecorded. History writes the names of kings, but eternity remembers everyone. The nameless of England's Dark Ages worked, suffered, and vanished, leaving the world built on their silence. Their lives were never written, but they were lived fully with hunger, with love, with pain, with endurance. They will never be in books.
Yet their absence is what gives history its depth, and perhaps that is enough to have existed, even if forgotten. Now close your eyes. Let the fires fade. Let the cold wind quiet. Let the nameless voices of the past hum softly around you. Sleep knowing that even those the world forgot once lived as fiercely as you do.